Free Lunch Podcast listeners, this is your boy Tight, and on today, the day that we release this podcast, a special woman in my life is celebrating her birthday, so I'd like for you all to join me in wishing my mom, a very faithful listener to the podcast, a happy birthday. Mom, I love you. Thank you for everything that you've done for me. Happy birthday. I hope you enjoy your day.
This episode of the Free Lunch Podcast is brought to you by the Selma Project, an initiative created to infuse hope and inspiration into the youth of Selma, Alabama through culture, art, and entertainment. It is a call on natives and friends of the Selma movement to use their gifts, talents, and resources to pave a road of success for future generations. Show your support and visit www.selmaproject.com. And brought to you by faithful listeners everywhere. And now to the show.
Cali, I got the West, man. Deuce got the Chris. So, man, what they gonna do now? The West and the Chris together, man. Montgomery, where you at? Where you at? Where you at? Atlanta, where you at? Where you at? Where you at? Birmingham, where you at? Where you at? Where you at? Oakville, where you at? Where you at? Where you at? Down south, showing no shame. Got the clubs and the club. We shaking that thing. Got the young player coming up on the run down. See the girls and they have to smile. Like, real tight. Why they say rice? He can't cheat to the end of the night.
Welcome to the Free Lunch Podcast, home of the New South Movement. This is your boy Tight, and I have my man BG with me. How are you, BG?
What's happening? Free Lunch Podcast. This is your boy BG in the place to be. Tight. Tell them where we are.
Man, we are in New York City. We are on the campus of Columbia University, and we are in the building. What building are we in, BG?
In the Pulitzer building.
Okay.
The Graduate School of Journalism.
We are. And so we are here today because as we continue to try to increase and improve the quality of Free Lunch Podcast, we want to bring you who we think are quality guests. We want to bring to you, the listeners, a product that is informative, it's educational, and it's about empowering. And so today, what we have for you is a special guest, and I want to give him the proper introduction because he definitely deserves that. And so let me introduce our guest today. He is Samuel G. Freedman. He is an award-winning author, a columnist for the New York Times, a tenure professor at Columbia University Graduate School of Journalism. He is the author of 7 acclaimed books. Most recently, and the one that we want to focus on today, is Breaking the Line, the season in black college football that transformed the game and challenged the course of civil rights. His previous books also include Small Victories, The Real World of a Teacher, Her Students and Their High School, Upon This Rock, The Miracles of a Black Church, The Inheritance, How 3 Families in America Moved from Roosevelt to Reagan and Beyond, Jew versus Jew, The Struggle for the Soul of the American Jewry, Who She Was, My Search for My Mother's Life, and Letters to a Young Journalist. Freedman was staff reporter for the New York Times from 1981 through 1987 and currently writes the column on religion. He was named the nation's outstanding journalism educator in 1997 by the Society of Professional Journalism. And with no further ado, I'd like to introduce the listeners, our family, our friends, to Samuel G. Freedman, author extraordinaire, professor, and we are glad and happy to have you here today, sir.
I'm really honored to be with you, BG and Jeremy.
It's definitely an honor.
It's definitely an honor. And what we typically do, just to give you a sense of who we are, we like to talk about different activities that happen in the South. We're trying to push different types of movement throughout not only in the South, but also throughout the country, and tell a story and tell those untold stories. And from a lot of your writings, that's what you do. So we felt like today we would like to talk about one of your most popular books. And before we even jump into that, if you could just kind of tell us about who you are and how you got into journalism, because from my readings and from just me learning about you, preparing for today's interview, I thought your story was very interesting.
Well, thanks for having me and asking me that. I'm probably one of these boring people who knew what he wanted to do from a very young age. I started thinking about doing journalism really in 1964, 65. In fact, BG, you're from Selma, but I remember writing a paper in my fourth grade class about the Selma March.
Really?
Yeah, my parents were both we grew up in central New Jersey, but my parents were both very, supportive of the civil rights movement. My father particularly was very actively supportive of it. And so I remember that being sort of my first beginning of journalism, was writing that paper about Selma. And on up through junior high, high school, college, I was always doing student journalism, and then came up the way a lot of journalists do, from small newspaper to larger newspaper, ultimately to the New York Times, where I started in 1981. But my goal had become writing books, and so by the late 1980s, I was able to move into that part of my life. And two things really bring me to breaking the line. One very simple thing is that I've always been a huge football fan, and I said to myself, I want to write at least one book about football, but I always felt that it should be about football plus something else. And I had been really introduced to the world of the HBCUs through my second book, Upon This Rock, which was a book about a really remarkable African-American minister, the Reverend Dr. Johnny Ray Youngblood, who's from the lower ninth in New Orleans, graduate of St. Aug, the famous black Catholic high school there, and then Dillard. And so Reverend Youngblood, even though he is pastoring in Brooklyn, was always talking from the pulpit about HBCUs to the families and to the children of the church. And so that sort of stayed in my mind when I started to think about football plus what else. And I was thinking football and race, or more specifically football and the movement. And then I said to myself, if there's one place where those lines would cross, it would have to be the HBCUs, because I knew two things. As a football fan, and I'm almost 60 now, so I remember some of the heyday of Grambling when they would come to Yankee Stadium to play. So I knew that they had these superb football programs at the HBCUs, and I also knew that the HBCUs were hubs of civil rights activity. John Lewis, Jesse Jackson, Diane Nash, all these people coming out of the HBCUs straight into leading the movement. So I just thought maybe there's a place where those two storylines converge. And I went up to one day in 2006 to the Schomburg Research Center, which is a branch of the New York Public Library devoted to African-American culture. And I have to give a shout-out about this. There was one book of history about black college football written by a man named Michael Hurd. So Michael Hurd, who's now living in Austin, Texas. And I sat there in the Schomburg and read through his book and discovered something I hadn't known about, which was that there was this black college Super Bowl called the Orange Blossom Classic, played every year for about 50 years. And I just started looking and saying, because I knew that Grambling and FAMU were the two most illustrious programs, did they ever play each other for the title? And I found a couple of years when they did play, and then several of those years were during the Civil Rights era. And so one was 1956, the other was 1967. And just a football fan part of me thought, wait a second, wasn't James Harris, on Grambling about that time? And I also literally ran back from the Schomburg to my office here at Columbia to Google James Harris. And when I saw that he was in his junior year that year and had won the MVP of that game, that was enough to decide to start on this book, because I knew how important he was as the first African-American to really be able to regularly start at quarterback in the NFL, really this Jackie Robinson figure. And I thought that's enough to start on. And what I discovered along the way is that there was also a great civil rights story in that 67 season at FAMU, which was about Jake Gaither, their terrific coach, using all this political leverage he'd built up over many years to get the all-white legislators, Board of Regents members, and governor of Florida to allow him to play the first HBCU versus PWI football game ever in the history of the South. So that gave me then kind of all the components any author could ever ask for.
So I'm excited because, just for the listeners, just to take a step back, the way I even heard about this book was I'm an avid, for those of us that grew up in the South, we love our football. And for myself, living in the state of Alabama, attending Auburn University, and then having that big rival with the university that I won't name, but I think we all know who those guys are. There's a popular radio show, a guy by the name of Paul Feinbaum. And for the listeners out there, what happened was one day I was listening to that show in the month of October 2013, and I heard Mr. Freedman talk about this story, what he just told us, and tell that story, and just sort of mention the book. So immediately after I heard that interview, I went online. Long story short, I purchased the book, and in doing so, I read the book, and after reading the book, I continue wanting to learn more about the story. And this is kind of what we want to do today, is share this story. But luckily, living in the D.C. area and Mr. Freedman, Mr. Harris, James Shaq Harris, and Mr. Hurd actually did a forum. And that forum was entitled Breaking the Line, Sports as a Catalyst for Social Change. And it was held at the National Archive Museum, Smithsonian. And I attended that event on that Wednesday, October the 23rd. And it was from that interview where I actually met Mr. Freedman. But it was that conversation that we kind of want to have today on today's show. And I really want to kind of remake what was said and what was done at that particular forum, because I think it's a story that definitely needs to be told, and you're the right person to tell it.
Well, let me jump in before we move. I just want to say Mr. Freeman's a great book.
Thank you.
So
Thank
I'm
you.
going to highly recommend that to the family to go check out Breaking the Lines by Samuel G. Freedman. For me, it's that perfect blend of sports like you talked about, but then the history. And then we talk about the civil rights area, which is an important time for me coming from where I'm from, Selma. And we've had a few episodes geared towards Selma and the Selma movement and Selma present time. So it was a great book. I felt like I was right in those stories. So, like I said, I highly recommend this book. But tell us a little bit about that forum and recreating that moment in time.
Well, I think the goal I had with the book was to tell this important but little-known chapter in civil rights history that I think a lot of people who follow sports and who care about issues of racial justice know about. People like Paul Robeson, and Joe Louis, of course, coming closer to the present, Muhammad Ali, Jim Brown, even very recently the way the kind of stands LeBron James has taken this year, which are so admirable. But and Jackie Robinson, but a lot of people didn't know about the role that these football coaches and student athletes at the HBCUs played in civil rights. And what I discovered is that it was so important, incredibly important, to achieve that through football, because football in the South wasn't just kind of incidentally segregated the way, lunch counters and movie theaters and buses and everything else was segregated. That college football, because it was almost like the religion of the South, was one of the strongholds of white supremacy. It was one of the last parts of Southern society to be desegregated. Incredibly, even after, people like George Wallace had to accept African-American students going to Alabama. That happened in 1963. And James Meredith, under federal guard, was able to enroll at University of Mississippi in 1961. It would take another 10 or 12 years for these schools to have an African-American football player. Mm-hmm. And so the idea that, that in Alabama with an all-white team, all-white coaches, an all-white fan base could compete to be a number one team was taken as a form of white supremacy. Unfortunately, even to this day at Mississippi, Colonel Reb, Confederate soldier, is still their mascot. Right. So what it meant to be able to do two things to break that down was huge. The first thing was the approach of Eddie Robinson and James Shaq Harris at Grambling, which is within our own world of the HBCUs, unable to play directly against white teams, we are going to develop a black quarterback so outstanding in every way, in his physical skills, in his intellectual capacity, in his leadership, in his ability to withstand race hate and baiting of all kinds, that he will be able to go to the pros and crack the color line. And that's bound to have a huge effect on society at large because, you know, James Harris is making that breakthrough more than 20 years after Jackie Robinson became the first African-American baseball player, well after the NBA got desegregated. And there had been black football players since the late 40s in the NFL. But the idea of a black quarterback went to the worst, most vile attitudes of the Jim Crow mentality, which is that blacks are intellectually inferior to whites. Blacks shouldn't be giving white people, even football teammates, orders. Blacks are quote-unquote natural athletes, but they don't have that strength of character. And so to be a black quarterback was to do even more than what Jackie Robinson had to do in the sense of the stereotypes that had to be shattered. So that was what Eddie Robinson and Shaq Harris were very deliberately doing at Grambling, working within the HBCUs to produce someone who'd be a leader for racial equality nationally. And then at FAM with Jake Gaither, his approach was to be able to play a game directly against a PWI, predominantly white institution, and prove that a black team and a black coach could compete. Because since college football was such a pillar of the system of racial inequality, and since the assumption on the part of whites in the South, except for an enlightened few of them, was that of course a white coach would be better, of course a white team would be better, Jake Gaither knew the only way you can destroy that is to play the game. And that's why these southern states and southern schools, the white ones, wouldn't play a black opponent. Because if you play the game and you lose, then, you know, the myth is shattered. And so Jake Gaither's whole goal was, we're going to go head-to-head. And he thought he could win, and he did win. He beat a very, very good team, University of Tampa, coached by Fran Kersey, team that was beating SEC and Big 8 teams and sending people to the pros. And that game, which gets played in 1969, is important not just because the Rattlers win, which is already a huge fact, but also because there are all these predictions. If you play this game, if you try to mix the races in a football stadium with everyone all intense because of the close game, you're going to have a race ride on your hands. That was sort of the redneck, attitude why you couldn't play that game. And Jake Gaither believed, and he was proven right, that you could have fans following both of these teams, a racially mixed crowd. And that game went down to literally the last play. FAMU hanging on to a 6-point lead, fourth down pass from Tampa into the end zone that gets knocked away. So it went to literally the last play, and no one was getting up in anybody's face. No one was fighting. There was no riot. It was an incredibly successful act. And that football game, and this is what I mean about what a hidden story or an undeservedly forgotten story this is, that football game between FAMU and Tampa, November 29, 1969, is the largest act of desegregating a public facility in the entire history of the South. There has never been a larger act of public desegregation than that football game. And, a lot of people think that Bear Bryant and Alabama played this, important game for, race relations and desegregation when they played against USC in 1970. That game came after. That was a year later than FAMU played Tampa. So Bear Bryant, who I don't give so much credit to, frankly. In fact, he was being sued up to, shortly before that game by civil rights attorneys in Alabama for not recruiting black players. He was just following on what Jake Gaither, and to give him credit, Fran Kersey had already done.
And what you see in this story for the people, interested in it, on so many levels, you have to appreciate the efforts of Coach Gaither and Coach Robinson, because they were at the front line. They were the beginning of it. So they had to have something within them. Dr. King talked about the content of character, they could have very well just taken the approach of just playing the game, being great football coaches, and being measured by wins and losses. But they saw the bigger picture. Both of them kind of had their own approaches, but in the greater sum of things, it all worked together. And then also the great amount of trust that the players had in those coaches. You know, those coaches built those programs, but those kids came in and trusted what they were doing. Shaq Harris trusting, you know, Eddie Robinson, telling him that you're going to be a quarterback, you're going to be undeniable. Even in the NFL, we're not selling for you being changed to another position, which was happening to a lot of players coming out. Great quarterbacks at HBCUs drafted into the NFL, but once they get there, they get converted to a wide receiver or a defensive back. And to bring it more recently, when I was playing ball, even in the youth league in Selma, you know, this was kind of 20 plus years after 1965. You know, in the youth league, my group was kind of the first group to really be a part of, in mass numbers, being black kids on these teams.
Right.
And we would see it. You would have great athletes, but none of us were playing quarterback on these teams. We were playing receiver, running back, tight end. I even got placed at tight end one year. You know, so that type of thing spoke to what Mr. Freedman was saying about just that supremacist attitude that, you know, blacks would not be able to be in that position of leadership and being able to process mentally things in a fast enough time to be effective at quarterback. So it's interesting.
It's two things, actually. And one comment I want to make is around the quarterback position. And it's even today how if you look back when you released the book in 2013, I believe there was a count of 9 starting black quarterbacks at the time. I would have to go back, but I believe it was 9 or 10 or so that was actually starting on the first day of opening day of the NFL season that year. But then you fast forward, and one conversation I was actually thinking about having with BG is that this is really the first year where you hear the conversation around a black quarterback and the term cerebral. So they're saying that Jameis Winston, not only is he have the athletic ability, but he's also a cerebral quarterback and one that understands the game and that can pass the test, and I find that interesting. But through your conversations with James Shaq Harris and some of the milestones that he was able to make, what are some of the stories and some of the things he shared around breaking that color line and some of the challenges he faced? One year, I don't know if you caught this in the book, but I go back and I look at the time that he was playing with the St. Louis Rams. Jaws was on his staff, and now I don't know if you know Jaws, but Jaws is this NFL guru, quarterback guru that's on ESPN and SportsCenter a lot. But I just found that interesting, just seeing the time period that he was playing with. So can you share some of the stories or some of the conversations as you was writing this book that Mr. Harris shared with you?
Well, I'll just give you a sense of some of what James Harris had to accomplish and some of what he had to endure. I mean, in a way, his story is this, you know, history-making black quarterback starts the day of the March on Washington because he's 16 years old. He's a junior in high school, coming off a state championship season at Carroll High School in Monroe. And he's already thinking, maybe I should have the coach change me to wide receiver or defensive back because I know they're not going to let me play quarterback in the pros, and I want to try to make it to the pros. But he's sitting there with his family. His father's a minister. His mom is a nurse. His sister and brother, older than he, they're sitting and watching the TV coverage of the March on Washington. And remember, no one knows what the I Have a Dream speech is because no one's heard it yet. It didn't exist yet. And as it's happening, they're in real time. And Shaq hears Dr. King talk about the content of our character. Right then he decides, I will not change positions. I'm going to stick at quarterback. He's so committed to that when he gets recruited by Michigan State, one of the top, 3 or 4 teams in the country, and he goes up there for his campus visit and realizes they're starting to size him up to play tight end, he turns down that scholarship to go to Grambling because Eddie Robinson is saying, we'll prepare you to be a quarterback for the pros. So to have that kind of commitment and then working in tandem with Coach Rob, Grambling didn't need Shaq to be a passing quarterback to win games. Grambling was one of those teams like Green Bay Packers. We're going to run 10 or 12 plays. We're going to execute them to perfection. It doesn't matter if the opponents know what we run. They can't stop us anyway. And they wanted their quarterbacks to be, a game manager. Don't make mistakes. Don't lose the game. We have all the other tools to win the game. But because that wasn't going to get Shaq ready for the pros, Eddie Robinson really revised the whole approach to his offense at Grambling to prepare James Harris to be a drop-back passing quarterback. And so that was another piece. And yet, even after the superb career Shaq had at Grambling, he didn't get picked in the NFL draft till the 8th round because the word had gone out from him and Coach Rob, he's not going to change positions. So basically the punishment is we're not going to draft you till a very late round. And he came into the Buffalo Bills camp 7th on the depth chart at quarterback and was starting on opening day. And I'll just mention a couple more things, the sense of what he had to go through. He kept a great deal of the hate mail that used to come to him, and he showed some of it to me. So I've seen with my own eyes these letters with, a lynch mob's noose drawn on them and drawings of watermelons and letters with the N-word all over the place. That's what he had to deal with day in and day out. And you mentioned Ron Jaworski. Jaws, I'll close on a story when Shaq is having his best years in the pros in the mid-1970s with the L.A. Rams. And they're playing a home game, but they would always, like a lot of pro teams, stay together in a hotel the night even before a home game. So he and Ron Jaworski's roommate go to check into their room, and they see there's a guard outside. And it turns out it's because there's been a credible death threat made against James Harris. And even the next day on the Rams sidelines, there are police officers and guards on the lookout for an assassin. So imagine having to play a pro football game. It's not enough that you have the pressure of being the only black quarterback starting and feeling like you're carrying the whole race on your shoulders. You also know that potentially there's some lunatic, some bigot up in the crowd with a gun. So that was the kind of thing that he had to surmount.
Courageous. And
Courageous.
In reading it, he still had that relationship with Coach Robinson. He would always call Coach Robinson to kind of get that reaffirmation and get that confidence building, which I think is kind of the central theme, or one of the central themes in this collection of stories, is the sense of community of people a part of these schools and these teams all working together, knowing that this is bigger than just wins and losses. So we have to work together. And from a journalist standpoint, you got Collie Nicholson down in Grambling, who took it upon himself to really get out there and really start talking about and writing these pieces about these games in such a way that it just captured everybody's attention.
Well, I'm so glad you brought up Collie J. Nicholson. And again, I mentioned Michael Hurd earlier. He's the author of a fantastic biography called Collie J, which I recommend to your readers. Well, what Collie Nicholson really did is what we would now call branding, but I don't think anyone even had that term at that time. But Collie J. Nicholson was a heroic figure himself. He was the first African-American combat journalist in the Marine Corps. He was very involved in the movement. In fact, during the Selma marches, he, as one of the prime people of the NAACP branch in Grambling, drove up to Selma with a contribution of money and was on the road. As we know, right after the successful march, Viola Liuzzo, a volunteer from Detroit, was ambushed and killed by a car full of Ku Klux Klansmen. So Collie J. Nicholson was on that road in that same sort of motorcade of marchers going back. And what he did is he looked at what Notre Dame was to Catholics in America and said, I want Grambling to be that for black people in America. He just worked tirelessly to get Grambling's word out there, and also in a broader way to get black college football noticed. He would write articles about Grambling and phone them in or send them by Western Union to newspapers all over the country, African-American newspapers, mostly white newspapers. He got to know important, sensitive, supportive white journalists, most of them not in the South, no surprise, but a few in the North. Howard Cosell on ABC, Jerry Eisenberg, who was a print journalist and also did TV producing and did a lot of work with Cosell. So he would cultivate friendships. In fact, he and Jerry Eisenberg were really like best friends. And those contacts helped give Grambling a national exposure. So even when, like, the newspapers in Ruston and Monroe and Shreveport wouldn't even send their own reporter to cover a Grambling home game, Collie J. Nicholson would get Coach Rob on Howard Cosell's national radio show. And it was really through Collie J. Nicholson that Grambling is able to go to Yankee Stadium in 1968, in September of 68, and play a game, the Whitney Young Classic, in front of 68,000 fans. And that is really the beginning of exposing HBCU football to a big, big northern non-black audience for the first time.
The question I have is really around Coach Robinson and the relationship that he shared with James Shaq Harris. So BG and I did a podcast on today's coaches and how today, specifically in basketball, you have the AAU programs and you have these coaches that are really trying to take advantage of and, for lack of better words at the moment, pimp the athlete or the young person that's really ignorant or doesn't really know about what's happening or what's going on through the process, the college process. Can you talk a little bit about Coach Robinson and the relationship he had with James Shaq Harris and how he was viewed by James? Because I think in today's society, we need more guys like Coach Robinson that can really steward and really take ownership and mentor and coach these young people.
Absolutely. I'm so glad that you asked that, Jeremy. For Coach Robinson and for Jake Gaither at FAMU and for a lot of the other great HBCU coaches at that time, Ori Banks at South Carolina State, Earl Banks at Morgan State, Joe Gilliam Sr., the great assistant coach at Tennessee State, Rod Page, who would later become Secretary of Education, who was at Jackson State and then Texas Southern, all of them saw the whole person. When they recruited a young man to play football, they didn't see him as a commodity. They saw him as a full human being, and they would promise the parents that your son is going to be in class every day, your son is going to be at church on Sunday. And as I've met the men who were playing at these schools back in the heyday, the 50s and 60s, some of them now 70, 80, even a few in their early 90s, what they all say is, I knew when I went up to Grambling or when I went, to Tallahassee, whichever the school was, that my football scholarship wasn't about getting to the NFL. It was about being the first person in my family to graduate from college. And the coaches set that model. Eddie Robinson and Jake Gaither both had advanced degrees. And the Southern white universities, of course, wouldn't let them go to grad school there. And most of the HBCUs didn't have graduate programs back then. So they went to these top-flight research universities in the north. Eddie Robinson had a master's from the University of Iowa. Jake Gaither had a master's from Ohio State and went on to do additional work at Yale. Every coach on Jake Gaither's staff had a master's degree. So they were highly educated. They were both married to educators. Eddie Robinson's wife, Miss Doris, was a high school English teacher. Jake Gaither's wife, Sadie, was a professor of English at FAM. So they also set this example of lifelong marriage. One of Eddie Robinson's famous aphorisms was one job, one wife, and he held to it. So they were very mindful of the example they set for their young men, and also in a very prophetic way, a very prescient way, they worried about what would happen when the PWIs started to recruit black athletes. Coach Rob and Coach Gaither were against segregation. They despised the idea of white supremacy, but they feared what integration would mean. They made a difference between desegregation and integration because they worried that these top athletes, when they got recruited by the Alabamas and the Tennessees and, the Arkansas and the Georgias, they would just be seen as gladiators. And when they were used up, they'd be left on the side of the road. And if they went to class, great, but if they didn't, no big deal. There would be no emphasis placed on them as student athletes, not in any cynical way, but in a real idealistic use of that term. And unfortunately, they saw it very, very accurately. I mean, obviously, there are some good examples to the contrary. Dennis Shaw at Stanford, at, Northwestern, Notre Dame have, strong graduation rates for student athletes. Richard Sherman was doing work on his master's while he was still playing football at Stanford. But those are unfortunately the rarities. And I couldn't agree with you more about it. Pimping is the right term, this exploitation. We've been talking football, but just earlier this week we saw 7 Kentucky basketball players go to announce for the NBA draft. There's so much of this one and done. And rent a player. How long are these careers going to last? What's going to happen then? And the great thing, the great example when I go to these Grambling reunions, which they have every year, or go to the HBCU Football Hall of Fame induction every year, is that people have all kinds of professions. Some people did play pro football, but those careers, even at the best, don't last much past your mid-30s. And people run businesses, and people are travel agents, teachers, ministers, insurance agents, you name it, professional musicians, all kinds of different life outcomes, and they're all living these substantial lives. And I think that is the real testament to what a coach like Eddie Robinson did.
I think you made a good point, because I had the opportunity at the forum to meet R.C. Gamble, and you write about him in your book, but also he's a retired 33-year senior executive federal law enforcement special agent. So I think that's a perfect example of what you were talking about with how coaches like Eddie Robinson and Coach Gaither, how they molded these young people to understand that it's bigger than football, and that even if you don't become a professional athlete, you're going to be a professional somewhere and doing something that's going to be of service and impact people, generations to come.
Exactly. You're going to get your degree. Eddie Robinson was famous for going through the dorm at Grambling and ringing a cowbell at like 6 a.m. to make sure his players all got up. Now, of course, there was no athletic dorm, so he woke up everybody, too. But, Jake Gaither, similar to Coach Rob, would have assistant coaches responsible for tracking their position players, their work in class, their class attendance, their church attendance. So when a player messed up, Coach Rob or Coach Gaither didn't call in the professor and say, hey, cut us a break here, we need to keep so-and-so eligible. They would call in the student athlete and say, Jake Gaither famously would say things like, if I can't trust you, who can I trust?
Yeah, that whole family aspect. And it's kind of close to me. A story like this is close because my parents are products of Tuskegee University, Tuskegee Institute, when they came through. So the HBCU experience is something that I'm familiar with from them, and the sense of family and that accountability that you talked about. The coaches as well as the faculty and staff expected certain things from the students, and they ingrained in those students' heads that you've got to be better than the best. We're preparing you to compete, and we're going to put you through the blood, sweat, and tears. You're going to go through the gambit, but by the time that you're done with this process, you're going to be ready to compete and excel no matter where you go. So that is a profound statement that we see, and I think we need a lot more of that in our community now. Is just this accountability from generation to generation. We're going to be the mentors and we're going to facilitate the process, but at the same time, you've got to be willing to, as a player, as a student, buy into it, and let's move forward together.
So I do want to kind of transition from the story of James and really touch on a little bit more of Coach Gaither. And the reason I say that is because I think if we look at his approach, and you may have even mentioned this in the book, but he developed a very good relationship with the governor of Florida at the time. And I think there was a lot of, maybe from some, he could have been seen as what we would call an Uncle Tom today. But he had a plan and he had a goal as to what he was trying to accomplish. And even with him getting approval in 1967 to have that game. The game didn't occur until 1969, which was 2 years later. So can you share a little bit about what you learned from the process that Coach Gaither took, even to build the trust with the governor and to get buy-in from the Board of Regents and those folks in the state of Florida?
I'm so glad you asked about that. Yeah, Jake Gaither was a very strategic thinker about civil rights and racial progress, but in a way he was so strategic that a lot of people misunderstood him and saw him, as you said, as an Uncle Tom. That term was definitely thrown around. Because you have to understand that Tallahassee and FAMU had a really active civil rights movement. There was a bus boycott in Tallahassee within a few months after Montgomery, and there were lunch counter sit-ins and boycotts of segregated movie theaters through the late 50s and early 60s. And there was a great minister in town, Reverend C.K. Steele, who was one of Martin Luther King's closest allies in the SCLC. So you had a lot of activity there, and Jake Gaither hadn't been involved in it.
I even think in the opening of the book, when he was first traveling, you talk about when he first even got on campus, what had happened or what had occurred with one of the guys that had gotten locked up for robbing.
Yeah, well, Jake Gaither in 1938 is coming down to take his first job at FAM as an assistant coach, and it's about 2 weeks after a double lynching in Tallahassee. Right. So, like they sometimes call the Panhandle Southern Georgia. This isn't the Florida of Miami and Tampa Bay. In any case, so he was well aware of a history of terrible racial violence, and Tallahassee was a completely segregated city for his years there. And Jake Gaither made a decision not to be out there with the movement. Partly he knew that because he was an employee of the state, he could be fired, the school could be punished, his players could be punished, and he had seen firsthand people got killed for standing up. That was not an idle fear. But he was always playing the long game, and that's what his critics didn't understand. He knew for years ahead that his goal was to be able to play FAMU against a white college's football team. He knew that was going to be a highly significant event in ending segregation. And so what he did was, over years and years and years, he basically, in a way that offended a lot of black people in Tallahassee, he sucked up to the white power structure. He befriended all these governors who were segregationists. He set up an all-white seating section at Bragg Stadium where FAMU played its home games, so legislators could come and sit there without, rubbing up against any black people at the football stadium. He contributed money to the Democratic Party when it was the party of segregation. And understandably, people in the movement were tearing their hair, because here's Jake Gaither, highly educated, erudite, a real student of black history. He gave amazing speeches about black history when he was out on the lecture circuit, as he often was, through churches and black high schools and so forth. So the thing, how can Jake Gaither, of all people, supplicate himself before the white man this way? But what Jake Gaither was doing was building up all this clout, making all these deposits in what I call the favor bank. And in 1967, he decided the time was right to go and cash in his favors. And what he did behind the scenes during that football season was go to the legislators, go to the Board of Regents, go to the governor, and say to them, I want to be able to play against a white college. And they knew they couldn't really turn him down because he had accumulated so much political leverage, and they knew that if they did something to really upset him, and he did end up becoming a very overt civil rights leader, they'd have big problems. If Jake Gaither was at the head of a march, they'd really have problems. So they couldn't say no, but they were afraid to say yes, because they thought, if we say yes and there's a race riot, we're going to get blamed. We're going to get voted out of office. So, these people on the Regents, there are a few somewhat moderate, but most of them were kind of conventional segregationists, but they weren't the most extreme. They were worried about the more extreme people coming after them. So what they settled on eventually was to give Jake Gaither a verbal agreement to play the game, but not putting anything in writing. Nothing was in writing, which when I was doing my research really baffled me. And then I tracked down 2 surviving regents who were both in their 90s, who separately told me the same story about the agreement being, we'll tell Jake Gaither he can play the game, but we're not going to put anything in writing, so we can't be held responsible. And then Jake Gaither spent 2 years trying to find a team that would play him. And if you've been in Tallahassee, or any of your listeners know it, the Florida State campus comes just about within 2 feet of FAMU's campus, but Florida State wouldn't play him. University of Florida wouldn't play him. University of Miami wouldn't play him, because they knew that FAMU had one of the best football programs in the country. I don't mean one of the best HBCU programs, I mean one of the best programs, period. And they didn't want to be the white school that got beat by a black school. But Fran Kersey, who I've mentioned a couple of times, was very idealistic. He had taken his job as head coach at Tampa on the promise that he could desegregate the team there. His predecessor as head coach had vowed there'd never be a black player on Tampa. So Fran came in as a change agent, and so he saw the chance to play against FAMU as both idealistic, because what it would contribute to desegregation, but also pragmatically, he wanted to show that he was open to having black student athletes come to Tampa, and playing this game was going to be great for his image, and indeed it helped him recruit some terrific players. But it takes 2 years for any white school to be willing to play FAMU.
When you look at all of the pieces, for me, it's elements that are applicable to today's time with the things that we're dealing with. We talked about the strategy and how Coach Gaither and Coach Robinson and Mr. Nicholson were strategic. They had an objective in mind, and they started planning and developing these ideas to get towards that objective. And then timing. This was several years after the Brown versus Board of Education, which made separate but equal illegal, but you still had in these states, practicing segregation in sports and even still in the classroom in the schools. And so you look at that, and then you just look at change agents, people who were willing to go against the grain and put themselves in position to achieve something good for the common people. And all those things working together on both sides of the fence, not only African-American people, but those from the white community that were willing to give their part into achieving this overall goal. So, I've just taken so much away from it in my own personal life, is just looking at those stories and reflecting on that.
And I think that's the reason why we wanted to have this conversation. It's the stories. There are 2 stories. It's a year in our history, 1967, that really hasn't been captured. And to be quite frank and quite honest with you, I find it interesting that a white man, as you stated, from New York would write a story about HBCUs and the game of football in the South. So I think it's a story that needs to be told, but I think you touched on this, and really to kind of get close to wrapping up, a few rapid fire questions. You answered some of them, but how long did it take you to write the book? Every book sets out, you said this in a previous article, every book sets out to answer a question. What does Breaking the Line set out to answer? So some of those are just some rapid fire kind of questions.
Great questions. The question Breaking the Line set out to answer is, what role did the coaches and student athletes in HBCU football play in the movement? What did they give to the movement? And it took me about 7 years. I teach at Columbia. I write my religion column for the New York Times. So it wasn't 7 years nonstop, but it was work spread over the course of 7 years. And I don't mind that. I have to say I loved every day I worked on this book, and it's great to still be talking about it now, in the aftermath of it being published, because it's one of those books I don't want to let go of, because it was such an honor. It really felt like a sacred trust. This goes to the question about being a white guy telling this story. It felt like a sacred trust to be able to carry this story out to the public. And I always tell my journalism students, no one can give you anything more precious than their story. And in this case, because it was a story that the black people who lived it were handing to me, a white writer, I felt like I had to care for it in an especially respectful way. And I just tried to make good on that obligation. I felt like I was here in service to the people who lived this history.
And I think you did an excellent job, and that's the reason why I don't want to go too much into the book. But I think we did a good job of just capturing the very essence of what the book is all about. And I really encourage listeners and those of you that enjoy the game of football, but also enjoy history and understanding what was happening in that time. This book does a great job of capturing that.
Yeah, and I'll just close out. You just talked about you write a religion column in the Times, and then you've written this book, and you also written a book about the black church. So you kind of touch on race and religion, which are very sensitive topics, in our society. So, and I'm sure, because you put it out there to the public, you probably get some negative criticisms and things like that. Our message is empowerment. So sometimes you got to step out there into some uncomfortable places to really get where you're going. In terms of empowering yourself, when you get those negative criticisms, how do you handle them? Or do you have any tips that you would give to our listeners when they run up against those type of obstacles?
Well, I guess the thing I would say is try to learn from your critics. They often will have, critiques of you that you can learn from. Don't just rule it out because it might be initially a critical comment. You have to sort of separate, and I try to separate who's mad at you just because of who you are, or because, you wrote favorably about religion and they think religion is a terrible thing. Someone like that, you're not going to have anything to learn from. But someone who says, I think I read that column, it was interesting, but here's a point I think you got wrong, and here's why. I try to always listen closely. I try not to get my ego too involved. Just last night I was at dinner with someone who had heard a speech I'd given and had some critical comments of it, and he came up to me before dinner and said, well, we can smoke a peace pipe tonight. And I said, what do you mean? And he said, well, because what I said to you about your speech. I said, no, I learned from that. There's nothing to have to smoke the peace pipe about. I'm glad to get intelligent, commentary and pushback.
Are you writing anything now? Is there a book that we should be looking forward to read?
Well, it's probably another one that'll be many years away, but I think I'm going to start on a book about the 1948 Democratic Convention, which was the first time they came out in favor of civil rights. And Hubert Humphrey, who's been largely forgotten, was the man who brought that to the convention. And I'm also looking for kind of, again, this group of less-known black heroes who Humphrey would have surely been in contact with, because it's an interesting period. It's right after World War II, so you have the whole double victory idea of black GIs coming back and really getting involved in the movement immediately after coming back from defeating racial supremacy, in Germany and Japan. And sometimes we think the movement began in 54 with Brown or in 56 with Montgomery, but actually there was a lot of activity with people like A. Philip Randolph right after the war and even during the war. So I'm going to start to move into that time period, I think.
I don't have anything else. I'm just in awe. I'm just excited and ecstatic about this opportunity that you've given us to come and talk to you today. So I don't have anything else.
I don't either, and we just really want to take this time to say thank you for allowing us to come up here and interview you about the book, and for you to basically enlighten our listeners. And I think you did a very, very good job, not only on the podcast, but definitely I encourage everyone to go out, purchase the book, Breaking the Lines. You can purchase it on Amazon. I got mine purchased on Amazon.
It's available on Kindle, electronic.
It's available on Kindle. So for any of the listeners that get an opportunity, go out and check out Breaking the Lines the season in black college football that transformed the sport and changed the course of civil rights. Is there anything else you would like to close out with? You mentioned you'll be at Alabama State, so I think that you should let our listeners know when you'll be there, and for those that are interested in coming to hear you speak.
Oh, thank you. I'll be there, I know, on the 29th and 30th of October. I don't have the exact times on each days, but I think that Alabama State will get the word out about that. And I'm also hoping, although the exact dates haven't been set yet, sometime this fall to be at Savannah State as well. So, I'm trying to get around to as many of the HBCUs as possible. But I just want to thank you, Jeremy and BG, for making the trip here to New York all the way from Selma in one case, and I'm just really honored to have your your support for the book.
Well, thank you. And BG, you want to tell the people how they can kind of reach us?
Yes, indeed. FreelunchPodcast.com for podcasts and blogs. Also, check for us on Instagram, Free Lunch Podcast, and on Twitter. If you got comments, Free Lunch Pod C.
Well, thank you. And this is the Free Lunch Podcast. We are home to the New South movement, and we are out of here.